Creating stored procedures. Stored procedures are a very powerful database object that you'll find in nearly every database out there today. And that's because they're like little mini SQL programs. We can create them once and use them many times. So in this nugget, we're going to define what a stored procedure is, talk about the benefits, we'll get familiar with the anatomy of a stored procedure, and then we'll jump into the virtual nugget lab and learn how to create and work with stored procedures. Let's get started. So a stored procedure is just a bunch of SQL statements compiled and stored in the database with a name that we call it by. And I really love to think of stored procedures as just little command line apps, SQL-based command line utilities. Just like ping or ipconfig, right? Let's look at ping here. Look at the help for ping. Look at all these parameters that it accepts, or arguments as we call them. So we pass in the name of the command line app in this case, and any parameters which are going to dictate how that ping is ran. Stored procedures work the same exact way. We're going to call it by name, we're going to pass it parameters, and it's going to go and do some work, and it may or may not return a result. A very popular use case for stored procedures is to use them as the data access layer for an application. So we can create stored procedures that cover all of the DML operations, give those to a developer, and they can bind those to their front end. In fact, when we get into the virtual nugget lab, I'll give you an example of how to build a stored procedure that acts as a search engine for a front end. Some benefits of using stored procedure. The first one's a big one here. This is the most performant database object we have. They are extremely fast, and that's because they're pre-compiled and cached. So this is the object you'll be using for all your heavy lifting, especially if you have, in complex processes or intensive operations that take a long time to complete, put it in a stored procedure. It's also a very efficient way to reuse and centralize your code. Another very popular use of stored procedures is to use them for validation and running business rules. So having all of that code centralized in the server and having the ability to reuse it makes them a perfect choice, again, for complex operations. It also simplifies security and data access, very much like views do, only this is really at the application level. We're not going to give users the ability to execute stored procedures. This is more for back-end stuff and for applications to tap into. And it's also going to reduce client-server traffic. Again, if you have SQL scripts that you're running from front ends or running from anywhere, all that is going over the network, and that can certainly cause a lot more chatter on the wire. So when we execute stored procedures, we're just sending a name and a list of parameters. Very, very small footprint on the network. Let's take a look at the anatomy of a stored procedure. So we have our definition, which is going to consist of our DDL, create procedure, and we give it a name. That's how we're going to call the stored procedure. Then we can have input parameters. And here we have 3 input parameters. And this means when we call the stored procedure, we're going to pass it parameters, just like we do when we pass parameters to command line utilities. Then we utilize those parameters. In this case, we just have a query that we're just going to add those parameters into the where clause for the values. And now we have ourselves a dynamic query because we can call this stored procedure a number of ways. You can see we can call it by passing in specific parameters or ignoring some parameters and getting different results based on those parameters. Now in this case, we have our last parameter declared with the default value. That's why our first execution here, we just ignore that, and that default will get filled in for the country parameter in this case. You can also have output parameters, and I'll show you these in the virtual nugget lab, but input parameters we use inside of the stored procedures. Output parameters we can pass back out to the caller of the stored procedure, and that's going to be popular when you're adding data into the database and you're auto-generating IDs. You may want to pass that newly generated ID back to the developer so they can tie that into the front end for that new data. Let's jump over to the virtual nugget lab and create a couple of stored procedures and see how to work with them. Welcome back to our database server here in the virtual nugget lab. Let's bring up SQL Server Management Studio. We're going to be working in the project here creating stored procedures. And if you want to follow along in this demo and try it on your own, the first thing you should do is run our setup.sql script here so we're all working on the same database, and then open up storedprocs.sql. So this database, once again, is going to be our certification database. We've got our 5 certification tables that we've been working with here since our normalization nugget where we learned how to design this database, and now we're going to create some stored procedures around it. So first, let's just start by creating a very basic stored procedure. This is going to be called get certification exam. So again, we start with our DDL here, create procedure, pass in the name, that's the name we're going to use to execute it, and then inside of our parentheses is where we define our parameter block. So this certification ID here is going to be a required parameter. We're not setting up any defaults for it, so the user will need to supply a value for this parameter every time they execute it. Then after as, we define our code block. And in this case, it's just going to be a simple query, right? A simple select statement that's going to pull back the certification, the vendor, and all the exams associated with that certification. We've got a couple of joins going on here. And then in our where, we're going to say where that certification ID equals our parameter. So when the user executes, or an application or whoever executes this stored procedure, where they're going to pass in that certification ID and get all the exams associated with it. So let's go ahead and create this very basic stored procedure to start. And now we can execute it just by calling an exec, pass in the name of the stored procedure and the value for that parameter. And you can also name these parameters, which will be useful when we have multiple parameters. So we could do something like this: certification ID equals 3. There we go. Let's execute the first one, our first code block here, and there it is. So this ID number 2 here is the MCSA SQL Server certification. So let's get to the 3 exams we have in there associated with it. Number 3 here should be the Windows one, and there it is, the MCSA for Windows, and there's the 3 exams associated with that. Now you can also find your stored procedures visually over here in Object Explorer. If you expand programmability, expand stored procedures, there it is. And if you drop it down, you can see the parameters that it accepts. And stored procedures can also return a value. Usually you can return a code regarding, the state. So if you have, if you're executing a stored procedure and, maybe the developer asked you, hey, pass this number back if this happened, pass this number back if that happened, then that's usually what return values are for. But generally, you're either going to return some data in the form of a result set like we're doing here, or nothing. Maybe it's a stored procedure that just goes and does something, right? Goes and runs a business rules across a bunch of tables to see if any data is valid or invalid. Let's look at another example. Let's scroll down here, and let's say that we want to get information around a learner's certification. Here's a little more of an advanced stored procedure here. So what we're going to do is pass in a bunch of parameters now. So we're defining multiple parameters, one for certification. Notice that we are setting up a wildcard as the default. So if a user doesn't supply a value, it just means all certifications. Same with vendor. And then here's a popular thing to do with stored procedures, especially when you're creating something like a search engine on top of data. You're going to have begin and end for your dates. So this is going to allow anybody executing the stored procedure to find certifications for learners where they were acquired between specific dates. And now inside of the body of our stored procedure, we're doing a little more work here. And this is really the power of a certification, is we can run lots of if statements, we can make decisions, have code branches, we can do all kinds of things. We're not limited to just a single statement. Generally, you're going to do quite a bit inside of a stored procedure. You're going to do some lookups, you're going to do some figuring out before you execute your code and return results. So what we're doing here is a little setup. We're saying if the user does not pass in a begin date, then we're going to reassign a value to this so it isn't null. And that'll help us with the complexity of our query below, because nulls mess everything up when you're writing queries. So that's why it's a good idea to do something like this, right? We're just going to overwrite the begin date of what they passed in if it's null with the minimum date acquired from learner certifications. This will get the absolute minimum date and put it into this variable. Then, same thing with end. Only this time we'll grab the max. So that'll give us the full range from top to bottom as far as date is concerned. And that'll make our query a lot easier, because then we can just run a date acquired between those dates. We don't have to worry about checking if it's null down here and making, a complicated where clause. We keep it nice and simple. So common thing to do right here. And if statements are awesome. You will get very familiar with writing if statements when you start writing stored procedures. And this is a very simple if statement that just checks, in this case, if this is null, and if it's true, it'll run this next block of code. You can actually get kind of crazy with if statements. You can run if else's on here. So we can do if, and I'm just going to put 1 equals 1, which is true. So if that's true, then begin, and how about we'll just print here, print true. There we go. Else, run this block of code. Begin, end, print false. There we go. So there's kind of the structure of an if statement. If, and then your condition. If that evaluates to true, this block of code is going to run. If that evaluates to false, this block of code is going to run. Cool, we'll leave that in there. We'll actually see this print true every time we execute it. But let's see, we've got all of our setup in place. We've got our big query down here that's going to run a like against certification name that passes in that variable for certification, which is going to flow down into here. If they don't pass anything in, it's going to default to a wildcard, which means all certifications. And we'll do the same thing on vendor. So let's highlight this big stored procedure here. We'll hit execute. Now it's created. Now we can execute this a number of ways. We can execute it with all of the default values. That's because we provided defaults for all of these. And when you do that, that means they're optional parameters, because their default value will get assigned. And let's see. In the way we're going to execute this, that means that both of these will have wildcards and both of these will have nulls. So we know that these will get filled in with their min and max date. And in fact, you know what we can do here? Let's do this as well. I'm just going to grab the begin date acquired. This is fun. This is really handy, by the way, when you're building stored procedures and debugging them. You can do things like this. We're just going to print that out. And let's do the same thing for date acquired, just to see what they are when we're testing. All right, so we're going to have all kinds of print statements in here. Now we just need to run an alter to change the definition. Highlight all that, and boom, we're good to go. Okay, let's execute get learner certifications. There it is. So there it is with no parameters, which means it accepted all the defaults. So if we look over to our messages, there's our low end, and there's our high end. So begin date acquired, end date acquired, and there's our true from our if else statement there. Cool. Let's do another one here. This time we're just going to pass in the certification. And how do you know that certification? Because we're doing it in order. If you don't supply names for the parameters, then it's going to pass it in the order in which they're declared. So in this case, this will give us everything that's MCSA, both SQL Server and Windows there. Here's another way to execute it. And you can also pass in default. If you don't want to supply a value, you want it to pick up the default, but you want to pass in a specific positional parameter, like we're doing here. We want to pass in vendor, but we want it to default to certification. We don't want to pass in null because that'll override it and that'll mess up our like, because like null is nothing. that won't give us anything back. So here we go. We can pass in default. It'll pick up the default. But this is definitely one of my personal favorite ways to do it, because then it's spelled right out. You know, when you're executing the stored procedure, you know exactly what parameter is assigned to what stored procedure, and then order doesn't matter as well. So here we're passing in the certification and the begin date acquired, and this will give us all of our MCSA certifications that were acquired in 2011. And here's another one where we're ignoring the first two parameters and we're just passing in our date range here. So here's everybody that acquired a certification in the year 2011, and there it is. Let's look at another one, this time with an output parameter. So here we're going to create a stored procedure that will allow whoever uses it to add new certifications into our certification table. We're going to have two input parameters here, one for the certification name and one for the vendor. But we're going to allow the user to pass in the actual vendor name, which means we're going to need to do a little work inside of the stored procedure. But notice our third one here is going to be an output parameter. That way, when we do insert the certification, it's going to generate that new ID, SQL Server, since we have this set up as an identity column here on our certification ID. We're going to need to take that and pass it back. So when the user calls the certification, they can catch that output parameter and use it. So if we look at the body of the stored procedure here, the first thing we're going to do is declare a local variable usable only inside of the stored procedure for vendor ID. Because we're allowing the user to pass in the vendor name, we're going to need to do a lookup into the vendor table based on the name of the vendor that's passed in to extract the vendor ID. And we're going to store that inside of this variable. And that's what we'll use then inside of the insert statement. But notice that we're allowing nulls inside of the vendor ID. And let's say that, this is kind of a legacy design. We don't have the ability right now to turn this to not null for whatever reason. So that means we're going to need to add a little error handling in here, just in case the user passes in something like Microsoft's instead of Microsoft, which would be an invalid vendor and equate to a null vendor ID. We're going to check that. And we're going to say if the vendor ID is null, then we're going to raise an error. And then we'll return. This is immediately going to stop the stored procedure, and this error will get thrown back to the user. So they'll have to look at their call and say, oh, well, I spelled Microsoft's wrong. It's really Microsoft. And then they could re-execute it successfully. So a little bit of error handling. You'll see that quite a bit in stored procedures. You can have error handling in here. You can raise errors back to the user when certain conditions aren't what you need them to be inside of the stored procedure. But after that, we're going to run our insert. Insert into the certification table. The values will be the vendor ID, if it is a successful vendor ID, if it's not null, and the name of the certification, which is the input parameter. So this will be the local parameter. This will be the input parameter. And then we're going to fill up that output parameter. Notice when we defined our certification ID, we specified it's an output parameter. You need to do that. And then we need to fill it up with a value. And we're using the global variable here at identity, which will return the most recently inserted identity value here in this table. And that's it. So let's go ahead and create the stored procedure. Hit create. Oh, I've already got one. So here, let's do this. Let's drop it. All right, I'm going to execute that with F5. Now it's gone. Now we'll recreate it. Boom, there we go. And again, if you ever need to change the definition of a certification of a stored procedure, just execute an alter with your changes, and that will change it. All right, so now to execute the stored procedure with an output parameter, we first need to declare, whenever we're calling this, we need to declare a variable to store that output parameter. Then when we execute the stored procedure, we'll pass in the values, and we need to pass in that parameter and specify that it's an output parameter. And that will match it up here with the certification ID inside of here, our output parameter. And outside, this doesn't have to be the same name. This could be a totally different name. We could call this cert ID or whatever. But that value will then get passed into this variable that we can then use, and in this case, we'll just print it out to the window. So let's highlight all this. In fact, before we execute this, let's execute it incorrectly. So we'll type in Microsoft's there, and what's going to happen here is nothing. See that? We get an error, invalid vendor supply. That's the error that we raised, and no data was entered into the table. Now, let's do it successfully. Let's pass in Microsoft, which we know that's a vendor that exists. And if we highlight it all and hit execute, hey, look at that. Good to go. One row inserted, and there is our output parameter printed, ID number 12, for our newly added certification. Let's take a look at one more here. Here's one for an update operation. So we're going to create a stored procedure called update certification. We're going to accept the certification ID and the new name of the certification. It's just an update statement here that will update the certification table, set the name equal to the new name where the ID equals the ID that was passed in. And so let's look at our certification table here, and let's say, we want to allow people to change the name. Like NetPlus should probably be Network Plus. So let's go ahead and create this procedure, and then let's execute it, passing in the ID of that certification, which is 9, and the new name. And if we execute this, there we go. We just executed the stored procedure, and it is now Network Plus. Let's head back down in Object Explorer, and let's refresh our stored procedures, and we should see all of our stored procedures inside of here, all 4 that we created. And again, if you want to manage security or do anything like that, you can just right-click on the stored procedure, head into Properties here. Here are all the properties, and we could assign permissions here to the stored procedure. We can grant execute permissions to users who are allowed, or applications who are allowed to execute the stored procedure. Another thing I want to show you here is if you want to create a stored procedure from scratch, you can get a head start here by right-clicking, choosing New Stored Procedure, and it'll write out the structure for you. So now you can just fill in the blanks here, add your body, and you're good to go. In this CB Tutorial, we learned how to create stored procedures. We defined what a stored procedure is, saw the benefits of using it, got familiar with the anatomy of a stored procedure. We saw that it's really just a compiled block of SQL that sits on the server that we can call many different ways based on the parameters that we provide. We saw how to create them in the Virtual Nugget Lab and how to use them. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.